Hello, this is Alex Leak, and today we're going to be going over a survey of security and privacy of communications on the sea. So right off the bat, we'll be going over each part of the paper, which includes communications on the sea, ship to ship, ship to land, network security, how network security affects maritime communication, how these communications are secured, the threats to these communications, solutions, and the conclusion. So first off, we're going to go over early maritime communications. These are semaphore flags. Essentially, these flag signals are the way in which many ships communicated, and this was all prior to 1857. So in 1857, the Marryatt's Code, which was generally used by most people, became the International Code of Signals after being drafted in 1855. This allowed for over 70,000 possible messages with only 18 separate signal flags, and this International Code of Signals was updated in 1901 to add more flags, and then 1937 to add all alphabetical flags, so A to Z, and numerical flags 0 to 9. With advances in technology, the need for these flags kind of dwindled. In 1908, an adaptation of transoceanic radio telegraphy became the basis of modern radio, and it was after an Italian inventor named Guglielmo Marconi successfully sent a wireless telegraphic signal in 1901 across the ocean. And after this, it was used for ship-to-shore and ship-to-ship communication. The way in which they communicated was Morse code, which is, of course, dots and dashes, and each individual letter required separate numbers of dots and dashes. So we're also going to go over the advances in technology. The Global Maritime Distress Safety System divides the sea into 4 sub-areas. So A1 is 30 nautical miles offshore. It requires a VHF, a DSC, and a NavText receiver. A2 is 400 miles offshore. It requires a DSC and a radio telephone. And A3 are pretty much all areas except the polar regions, essentially. And it requires all the equipment from A1 and A2 and an Inmarsat and or a high frequency radio. And A4 is outside of all A1, 2, and 3 areas, and it's generally just the polar regions. And this requires all previous equipment and an HF radio service.
Hello, I'm Coleman here to present more on our survey of security and privacy of communications on the sea. Previously discussed in the previous slide, we went over the 4 types or classes of different devices and communication radios that are available for vessels that are on the sea. So the first class I would like to discuss is the A1 class, and this includes a VHF radio, a DSC radio, and a NavText receiver. VHF radio stands for a very high frequency radio, and it is required by law to be placed on all watercraft overseas or on the seas. And they can transmit distress signals to all nearby radios if need be, such as a mayday as if the boat was going down. And the frequency of these radios range between 30 and 300 megahertz, and thus they have a very small range. Generally, the sender and receiver must be within line of sight to use a VHF radio. So if another ship or radio tower is over the horizon, a ship would not be able to communicate with whatever they were trying to communicate with. And communication must be limited to operational purposes, such as communicating about navigation. That being said, if you are using a VHF radio, you should not be using it to talk to your fishing buddy that is on the ocean trying to catch some fish. It should be strictly about navigation and professional communication. As you can see on this slide, this is a simple sample version of what a VHF radio looks like. Pretty straightforward. And the next radio I would like to talk about that is still in the A1 group would be the DSC radio. And then DSC radio stands for Digital Selective Calling. And it is a form of VHF radio. It is implemented on them. And you have the option of medium frequency or high frequency radio services. And this service allows ships to send a message in the form of a distress alert to the U.S. Coast Guard instantly. And it's unique to the VHF because the user can be away from the radio and not miss a message being sent to them. For example, if a distress signal was sent out to all ships and the captain was not by his radio, that's okay because the radio will store it similar to a phone stores a voicemail, and you'll be able to replay that message later on when you get back to your radio. And the requirements of this radio, all passenger ships and ships over 300 gross tons sailing on international seas are required to have this DSC implementation on a radio. And this requirement was established in 1999 at the Safety of Life at Sea Convention. So the next A1 radio I'd like to discuss is the NAVS text receiver. And it is a system for relaying navigational and meteorological warnings and forecasts that relate to maritime safety information, also known as MSI. And it usually prints these transmissions from the National Weather Authority in Italy, the Navy, or Coast Guard from the United States, or the National Navigation Authority of Canada. This receiver was created with the intent of having a low-cost, simple, and automated means of relaying important information to ships nearly 200 nautical miles offshore. The NAVSTEC messages are transmitted using BFSK, which is a binary frequency shift keying, which is a technology also used in caller ID and garage door openers. This is a picture of a NAVSTEC receiver printing off a message. For example, if a weather service was to issue something, this is what it would look like. So the BFSK technology in the NAVS text messaging, it uses a pair of discrete frequencies to transmit binary information, zeros and ones if you don't know what binary is. Uses 7 bits for characters where 4 of the 7 bits are marked bits and 3 of them are space bits. And used for forward error correction, FEC, which extends the size of the bits to larger, essentially to fix transmission errors. Example, if encoding a 2-bit block of data, 00, FEC adds bits to a 5-bit block of data, making it 0000. This allows for bits in between to act as buffers. So instead of transmitting 01, the transmission would send 00011. Essentially extends the number of bits to the correct transmission errors. The next radio I will talk about is the radio telephone. It's used primarily for changing ships' itineraries and performing business at sea. Required for ships within the A2 area, but much of the use of the radio telephone has been made obsolete with the use of satellite telephones that we have today. Maritime Mobile Service is an internationally allocated radio service, and it's used primarily to split into 2 classifications of marine radio stations: stations on land and stations aboard ships. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, regulates these services for the ships of the U.S. Registry in international waters and all ships in U.S. territory. The next device I would like to talk about is the high frequency radio. And they operate very similar to the VHF radio that was mentioned earlier in previous slides. And this is how they work. The hardware known as a transceiver transcribes a message to a receiver, which in turn sends the high-frequency radio waves out into the Earth's atmosphere. The waves are then reflected back off of the ionosphere located in the atmosphere, and when the waves are bounced back to the ground, another receiver will pick up the radio waves. For example, in this diagram in the bottom corner of your screen, there is a tower that the red line is the radio wave, and it goes up, bounces off of the ionosphere back down to the ground. And as you can see, it goes way further than direct wave would or a ground wave would when trying to communicate. So Inmarsat is a British telecommunications company which originated from the International Maritime Satellites Organization. Inmarsat was established in 1979 at the International Maritime Organization, which is the United Nations maritime body. In the mid-1990s, many members of the IMO were unwilling to invest into the infrastructure of the Inmarsat. In 1998, Inmarsat was privatized with the International Mobile Satellite Organization, IMSO, taking its place in Inmarsat's operational unit, becoming the modern Inmarsat Ltd. Now, Inmarsat is the leader in providing the satellite and radio equipment that conforms to the Global Maritime Distress and Safety System, the GMDSS. Here's more about the Inmarsat. Inmarsat is colloquially known by sailors for the radio and satellite services. That is, the equipment, although not technically named Inmarsat, is commonly known as Inmarsat. Inmarsat uses Inmarsat C and Fleet 77 services for distress alerts, which are satellite services. Inmarsat C is a two-way store and forward communication system that transmits messages in data packets. Inmarsat C is comprised of a small antenna, a compact transceiver, a messaging unit, and a dedicated distress button to activate a distress alert. Due to its satellite functionality, the ground network is available at 99.9%, which is important for distress signals. So we've discussed the different radios and how they work and run when it comes to communications on the seas. Now I'd like to discuss military communication. So, which is huge because the United States Navy is one of the largest navies in the world. They currently have over 430 ships and submarines. With that being said, they need to communicate. In the past, they used many crude communication methods such as Morse code. They would flash lights at one another when sailing near another boat. But today they use many of the communication methods that we listed previously in other slides. Commercial shipping is also huge on the seas, and they make up a large amount of the vessels on the seas today. In just 2019, there was 53,732 merchant ships traveling on the seas. With a number that large, communication is a key issue to ensure meaningful and safe travel. As you can see in the figure below, this shows the different types of commercial ships that were out on our seas in 2019, with general cargo ships being the most, followed by oil tankers, chemical tankers, container ships, passenger ships, and natural gas tankers. So now that we've discussed communication methods, I would like to briefly touch on network security. And to start, I would like to discuss the CIA triad. And the definition of network security has to deal with the security of various types of networks that transport data or information over software or hardware devices. And according to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, network security focuses on three main goals, which is known as the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which I will get to next. Here's a figure of the CIA triad representation. As you can see, the data protected on the inside, followed getting protected by confidentiality, integrity, and availability. All three of those goals need to be met in order to have network security. So the first goal, confidentiality, deals with the protection of sensitive information and data being sent across a network. meaning unauthorized access to information should be prohibited. An example of confidentiality would be encryption, file permissions, and access control lists. The next part of the triad I would like to talk about is integrity. This deals with the protection of data or information from, modification or deletion. This ensures the receiver of the information is indeed receiving the information that the sender intended to be received in an unmodified manner. For example, if I sent an email to you, integrity would be held up if you received exactly what I wanted you to send and no one was able to grab it in the middle, change it, and then send it to you. And the last part of the triad I would like to talk about is availability. This refers to the literal availability of information on a network, meaning that all of the access channels, the mechanisms, and systems are all functioning properly on a network. So there's different levels to the network security threats. There's a low, moderate, and severe, and this is from the CIA model that was previously just mentioned. So the lowest level of threat is the low threat. And network operations, if an attack was to happen that is low, will operate in a normal manner, but in a degraded fashion. But there will be no damage or loss to the information on the network. The next level of threat is moderate. A threat can significantly degrade operations, but primary functions within the network are still operable. There can be significant levels of damage, though, to the information if there's a moderate threat. And the highest of threats is severe. This is the highest threat level, and catastrophic damage can occur to the information stored on your network. And system operations as well can be heavily degraded. So the system could slow down or even come to a complete halt if a severe attack was to compromise your system. And here's a table of the threats with the low, medium, and high, or like I called it, the severe rating, and how it deals with the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of a network.
So I'm going to be going over navigation systems on the seas. Many ships communicate with not only other ships, but also ports and systems within the ships. There are multiple types of technologies that are used, so satellites for location tracking, electroacoustic transducers, and pitot tubes for speed calibration, and other computer technologies for dead reckoning. And the threat of these technologies is essentially increasing, especially when the number of crew members is decreasing. So each crew member is more responsible for more systems and, has, fewer attention being paid to each individual system. So first we're going to go over location measurement. The first satellites were launched in 1960s, and these were called the transit system. And they were pretty good, and they would allow a vessel to accurately locate itself within 180 yards. Transit required a small digital computer to do computations and also a measurement of both the magnitude and the rate of change of the Doppler shift. And this was great for most ships because the Doppler shift wouldn't be that great. But if the system using the transit system, such as a plane, had a very high increase or decrease in velocity, it would impact the accuracy of the readings. So many aircraft, readings became inaccurate because they would increase their speed or decrease their speed extremely quickly. In 1973, the United States launched the Global Positioning System, and in 1978, the first two Navstar GPS satellites were launched into orbit. Now there are 24 satellites in orbit, and I believe they're on a 12-hour orbit, so one rotation around the Earth takes 12 hours. And this system is much more accurate than the transit system in the 60s. It can accurately provide users with their location, with their longitude, their latitude, and their altitude, all within 30 feet. It's also better than the transit system because GPS location can be updated as often as 40 times per second if you have the correct device, and it's used by pretty much a lot of locational services. For speed measurement, there was a French hydraulic engineer named Henri Pitot in the mid 18th century, and he created a Pitot tube, which essentially measures the speed of flow in a river. The way it works is water will enter one tube, and it will push against the pressure of another tube that's also within it. And this pressure is measured by a sensor in modern ships that allows you to translate that change in pressure to in terms of speed, in terms of nautical miles. There are a bunch of other technologies that are also used for speed measurement. One is electroacoustic waves. These can either be suspended in the air or in the water, and it's essentially attached to the front of a ship, and a sensor is attached to the back of a ship, and the sensor knows when the first wave goes out and when it receives when the sensor detects it, and it can calculate the speed and the change since the ship length is fixed. Many people say that if you're in the water, the speed in which the sound wave travels through the water is affected by the salinity and the temperature of the water. However, this change is so minuscule that it does not really affect very large readings in terms of like knots. Another type of determining speed is another technology is the electroacoustic means of determining speed, and it uses the Doppler effect. This essentially projects sound waves either against the bottom of the ocean or a cliff, just as long as it's stationary, and it measures the change in pitch from the returning sound wave, and you can measure speed through that. Dead reckoning is the act of determining a ship's current location given previous positions, or finding a future location given the speed, current position, and course. It's a great way to calculate short distances, but due to the increasing number of compounding errors, a new fixed point has to be found and the process is repeated. So originally when this process was done, a protractor and a straight edge was used, but now there are a lot of modern inertial guidance systems which are used. And they take in input of speed, direction, and sometimes wind velocity to calculate dead reckoning. So the threats to these systems are very real, and they're not only left to ship or ship-to-shore communication. There are a lot of other structures that are on the maritime transportation system that can be affected. Oil rigs, shipping yards, and ships all rely on systems that are either outdated or unsecure. And although this is the industry standard to require special equipment for many ships, that technology has pretty much no encryption or cybersecurity. The attacks on ship systems, one example is researchers from UT Austin fed spoofed GPS information to a yacht, and even though the yacht veered off course, the GPS navigation system was not affected. In another example, the NCC group, which is a cyber security group, penetrated the ECDIS product that the product that held the electronic chart display and information system, and manipulated files within that product, which also could have led to falsifying of information and deleting courses for a vessel. Finally, the most exploitable technology aboard these ships is the automatic identification system. This is essentially a way for ships to send out distress signals, or also to keep track of other ships. But there are a lot of attacks since it doesn't have any verification or encryption. An example of these attacks are a frequency hopping attack, where the attacker poses as port authorities and forces the victim onto a blank channel so that the victim can't receive or send out any signals. Also, there's another DDoS-like attack, which is essentially flooding the victim with a bunch of AIS data, which overloads the victim and essentially does not know which is real and which is fake. Attacks on the oil rigs. So there's one attack that basically attacks the dynamic positioning, which is the computer controlled system that maintains the position of the oil rig. So there's one attack that attacked the GPS of it and caused it to tilt, which is extremely hazardous, and shut down the oil rig for, I believe, 19 days. Finally, we'll go on to attacks of ports and cargo. The most infamous attack is from organized crime that was ongoing from 2011 to 2013. Hackers were able to manipulate cargo shipments and essentially load containers full of drugs directly onto trucks and delete information that the cargo was ever even there. After a firewall was installed to prevent the hackers from entering the system, criminals used spear phishing techniques to employees' emails, and also broke into the facility and planted software that captured keystrokes so that they could log into the employees' accounts. So there are some security threats on the C theories. Here's what we think if a security threat was enacted. First of all, there would be a security breach on a naval ship and a state-sponsored attack used to break the confidentiality of naval communications. An enemy could intercept messages being sent to and from a ship, and the attacker could then figure out the Navy's plan or current heading. Another theory we have about a threat for national security on the sea is there's a security breach on a command vessel, and vessels have a similar way of navigating using GPS like autonomous vehicles, and an attacker could rootkit to reach administrative level and adjust coordinates or just shut off the engine's power or the ship. So here are some possible solutions to a lot of the cybersecurity threats that are seen in this presentation. We could increase budgeting for proper assessments since there's very little want or need for cybersecurity as of right now. We could also increase the number of crew members to allow more specialization and to pay more attention, and also create higher standards for the satellite and radio security. We should also have message authentication for all transmissions so that attacks on AIS can be stopped easily. And in conclusion, the security threats that are present in maritime communication are not as simply dealt with as those security threats on land. This is because ships need technology for communication in the ocean, and this makes them very vulnerable to be extremely reliant on that technology. We should set in new standards to correctly assess threats and vulnerabilities in the ship system, and the industry standards should be reevaluated, and more encryption and cybersecurity protection should be at the forefront of all technologies.